Hello and welcome to Blue Wall Politics inside the key Heartland's Battlegrounds deciding the U.S. election, a special Heartland's Transformation Network event hosted by the Jefferson Education Society. I'm Ben Spagan. I'm the Vice President of the JES, a nonpartisan think tank headquartered in Erie, Pennsylvania, offering world-class programming, publications, and plenty more worldwide. The Heartland's Transformation Network is a transatlantic collaborative partnership dedicated toward closing geographic economic divides and reconnecting residents of rural and former industrial heartlands communities to economic opportunity. The network members work to return community pride and optimism about the future and diminish the appeal of polarizing, resentment-driven, isolationist, and ethno-nationalist political movements that threaten our democracies. Here we'll discuss the U.S. presidential election in context between the Harris-Walz and Trump-Vance tickets, the implications, the high stakes globally, and how seemingly only a few, 7 of the U.S.'s 50 states are quote-unquote up for grabs, with 3 of those states in the industrial heartlands of the country. For key real-time insights, we're going to turn to a panel of award-winning journalists and commentators for a discussion moderated by Julianne Schaubel, a U.S. correspondent for Der Tagesspiel. Before I turn things over to Julianne, I want to go through some housekeeping. We are hosting this event both via Zoom webinar and are live streaming on the JES's Facebook page. If you're watching via Zoom, we're going to take questions from you, the audience, using the Q&A function. And if you're tuning in via Facebook on the JES's page, leave your questions and comments in the comment section of this post. We're going to work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can, following a robust discussion amongst the panelists. Now, if you happen to be listening to or watching a later broadcast, streaming this discussion on demand, still send us your questions or comments to keep this conversation and others going. You can submit those on the JES's Facebook page or our YouTube channel. And for more information about the Heartland's Transformation Network, as well as upcoming JES programs and publications, visit our website, jeserie.org. Be sure to connect with us on the social channel of your choice. Now to introduce the panel and to begin the conversation on Blue Wall Politics inside the key Heartland's Battlegrounds deciding the U.S. election, I'll turn things over to Julianne. Julianne, over to you.
Thank you, and good morning from Washington. I thank you so much for organizing this important event, which gives us too a lot of insights, I hope. And it's a very crucial time, 25 days before the election, if I've counted. And it's interesting that you can trust a German journalist to lead this discussion with so many experts here. Even though Hurricane Helene and Milton are devastating parts of the Southwest and currently dominating the headlines, the topic of our conversation today is still probably the most crucial one. You don't have to be a super pundit to know the Rust Belt has the ability to decide elections. The 3 industrial states of the so-called Blue Wall, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, have voted for the same candidate in every presidential election since 1988. With Donald Trump's, for many, surprising victory in 2016, the region has come into national and, I can say this, international spotlight. And it has stayed there, even though Biden won it back in 2020. Many of the explanations and narratives that were found after 2016 are still relevant to understand today's politics. So I'm so glad to dive into this with 3 experts of the 3 battleground states. It's Chuck Grumbach, I hope I pronounce it correct. That sounds very German, who is covering Wisconsin government, politics, and business with WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR station. Also joining are the co-hosts of the weekly podcast, It's Just Politics, Zoe Clark and Rick Pluta. Zoe is the political director of Michigan Public, and Rick is the senior capital correspondent of Michigan Public Radio Network. Last but not least, we will hear from Jeff Bloodworth, who is a professor for American political history at Gannon University in Erie, Pennsylvania, and contributor to Erie News Now, the Liberal Patriot, the Free Press, and the Erie Reader. I hope I have not made any mistakes. Looking forward, we have roughly an hour time, a little less. We will start with some questions here and are happy to get yours. Let's get right into the discussion. Chuck, my first question goes to you. The shock of Donald Trump's win over Hillary Clinton in 2016 was very big for Democrats. What do you see? How have they changed their approach to the states you are looking at?
Well, it was a big shock. It was the first time that Wisconsin voters had gone for the Republican presidential candidate since the 1980s. And polls had shown, but just before the 2016 election, that Hillary Clinton was up by a little bit. And the campaign decided not to campaign here. It had to have Senator Clinton campaign in Wisconsin. So Donald Trump came and built up some momentum and won. What we've seen since then is certainly in 2020, Joe Biden campaigned here a lot, as did Trump. And 2024, we've been getting the candidates about every 2 weeks, or their surrogates just about every day. So there's a lot more activity, a lot more money being spent in Wisconsin, which, for 10 electoral votes, only 6 million population, we might be punching above our weight a little bit, but it's considered a battleground state, and I guess rightly so.
Are the issues still the same than in 2016?
Well, it's somewhat of a geographical thing. I mean, we're right 1,000 miles more from the U.S.-Mexico border. So, but Trump here is suggesting that illegal immigrants, have brought in fentanyl and other woes. Democrats suggest that, well, a lot of people are coming here to work at dairy farms and other small businesses that need workers. And so there's a divide over immigration here. There's also the issue of inflation, which is a national issue. And then there's sort of this rural urban divide here that probably is the case in many states, where the city of Madison, fast growing and very, very blue, very, very Democratic, teams up with Milwaukee, still largely blue in the Milwaukee area. And then the fight is in some of the suburbs now in a lot of northern Wisconsin, which has gone for Trump, but some isolated cities up that way that are still blue. So it's somewhat piecing together the Democratic coalition and the growing Democratic coalition out of Madison, and cutting into the opponent's areas, losing by less is the Democrats' phrase in some of these Republican areas. And the Republicans say the same thing. They've been in Milwaukee. Trump was in Milwaukee last week, and Trump was in the Madison area last week. So it's back and forth geographically, as well as some of the issues.
Mm-hmm. You just mentioned the two kind of rust belts. We can see the divide in these states. Zoe, when you look at that, we have the cities, the university, the prosperous cities that are trending more and more blue, and the rural parts. Which side is going to dominate this election?
Right? That's the question. So much of what Chuck just said, you could have inserted instead of Wisconsin, Michigan, and my guess is Jeff will think the same about Pennsylvania. And I thought it was really interesting, the statistic that these three states have voted the same since 1988. So Michigan really is a microcosm of the United States. We have a big population center in the city of Detroit that had previously enthusiastically voted for Democrats. We also have huge amounts of rural land, including in the UP, right? But there's fewer folks in those rural areas. And so what I often like to say about 2016 is less that Donald Trump won Michigan, but Hillary Clinton lost Michigan. Democrats simply did not turn out in the way that they had with Obama, for example, in 08 or 12. And so when we talk about sort of this idea of losing less, right, what Kamala Harris and what Tim Walz have been doing as they come to Michigan is going to population-rich areas. So a city like Detroit, where turnout needs to be high, as well as you mentioned, and similar to Madison, college town areas where they are trying to get enthusiastic Democrats who have become re-engaged since Kamala Harris is now the nominee rather than Biden. So college towns where the University of Michigan is, where MSU is, this is where Tim Walz has been. As well as just this week, we've seen Gretchen Whitmer actually at a sorority at MSU. So this idea of trying to get college students to turn out, and as Rick Pluta, my co-host, will say, college students to turn out and then hopefully bring a friend if you're the Democrats.
What strikes me as interesting is that we talk about swing states, we talk about swing counties like Erie County, for example, but in these last weeks, we get the impression that it's so much about turning out your own base. It's less trying to really convince the other side. Is that correct, or are the campaigns doing both, and it just seems to be consolidating the base?
Well, I'll throw that to my co-host because he talks a lot about GOTV, get out the vote.
Yeah, well, one of the things that we're seeing in Michigan, and I guess I'll also just do a little more table setting, which is that in the last election cycle 4 years ago, where our statewide elected officials, the governor, the attorney general, the secretary of state, that election came on the heels of the U.S. Supreme Court's abortion decision that reversed Roe versus Wade and threw it all to the states. And there were ballot questions on that. And that really drove Democratic progressive turnout. And so, Democrats just had a great year. Simultaneous to that, the Republican Party in Michigan, the more conservative one, was in a state of near collapse. And so Democrats and progressives were able to capitalize on that. And, we'll see how that carries off into this election. The Republicans are not in such bad shape as they were 4 years ago, although they're still behind in some key metrics like fundraising. So, and I think it was Chuck who was talking about lose by less. That's the Republican goal in urban areas like Detroit, is to not, they know they're not going to win them, but if they could persuade some voters, including Black voters, who are maybe not maybe progressive skeptical, that typically they would vote with the Democratic Party, but they might be seeing some things that are just a little bit too much right now. They might be, really concerned about the economy. And so Republicans are hoping that maybe they can shave off enough of those voters that they won't lose the urban areas by quite as much. And then, you talk about the blue wall states, and Zoe talked about is that we've got the urban-rural divide. And the other thing that Republicans are, and Democrats are focusing on is, like Zoe said, get out the vote. And Republicans who were very skeptical of some new laws and an amendment to the state constitution that makes it easier to vote, early voting and absentee balloting, which people in Michigan are voting right now via absentee ballot, that they're now trying to get their base, the Republicans, to abandon their initial skepticism and start voting early, because just as a practical matter, seasoned campaigners will tell you, a vote that you already have, cast and in the bank is one that you don't have to fight for on election day.
Jeff, we've heard about the enthusiasm gap that Kamala Harris is supposed to have closed. Is that your impression too when you look around? How big is the enthusiasm? How decided are people to actually go out and vote?
Well, certainly,
I can tell you, in speaking with the Erie County Democratic chair, he told me when they switched, the Democratic ticket switched to Harris, he said the number of volunteers, the number of phone calls went up exponentially. And so this is that narrative is not one created by the media. That's something that's wholly on the ground. And you see, look, in Erie, famously, Hillary Clinton's campaign, they didn't even distribute yard signs. I mean, that's how bad their campaign was in 2016. A fine senator, terrible candidate, ran a terrible campaign. And so yard signs for Erie Democrats really matter because everybody remembers not only did Hillary not come here, they didn't even bother to distribute campaign materials. And so the party has made a real effort in this region of having yard signs to especially counter what we saw in 2016. The Trump signage was a signal of the enormous energy. And if you look in 2012, Obama throughout Western Pennsylvania would lose rural counties by 60-40. And so he'd lose, but it was somewhat competitive. And what Trump was able to do was to add 2,000 or 3,000 more votes throughout rural Western PA. And those 60-40 margins became 75-25, 80-20. And so the signage, which was everywhere in rural Western PA, even in the city of Erie for Trump, really demonstrated something substantial and tangible. So there is real enthusiasm for Kamala Harris. I mean, I think a lot of it is amongst Democrats, a dread of Donald Trump equals enthusiasm for a more charismatic, younger, vigorous candidate. And Kamala Harris has proven to be a pretty good candidate. I think she's the best of the 3 Democrats that have run against Donald Trump. And so you do see and hear and feel that enthusiasm in Erie.
Chuck, and still, the election outcome is still in the margin of error, apparently. The polls are so close. It's going to be, I think, a terrible 4 weeks for everybody who's watching, because the feelings are going up and down and going in both directions. Why is Donald Trump's appeal still so strong in these 3 states, or in your state? Chuck, are you here?
Yes, sorry about that. Yeah, well, I was just at a big rally of Trump's in Dodge County, about an hour northwest of Milwaukee, and I was talking to voters there, and there's some blue-collar welders I talked to who like Trump's idea to remove taxes on overtime pay, even though nonpartisan budget analysts have said that would cost the Treasury quite a bit of money. Other folks talked to a Lutheran school teacher who liked Trump's support for taxpayer-funded vouchers for schools to send kids to parochial and private schools. Also liked Trump's values. We didn't get into some of the things Trump has said and done over the years, but that's what she said, is she liked Trump's values, liked his views on immigration. And as I say, he, at that rally in Dodge County, said, well, no, I think, even bigger than inflation and the economy, that immigration is #1. So it's some people are going along with that. He got a lot of applause when he suggested one of his first things would be to do is send illegal immigrants back to their home country.
One special aspect in Michigan, especially, are the uncommitted voters. Rick, can you tell us that issue has gone up and down in the national attention, I would say, international ones too. Over the summer, I think it was a little bit more quiet around it, but now we see it. We see protests every single time Kamala Harris or Tim Walz are campaigning. I don't see it at Trump rallies, which is still fascinating to me. How are they actually going to matter? What is your...
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic that that there is a large Arab Palestinian population in Michigan, especially in Metro Detroit, and so that vote can make a big difference here. It matters in both political parties. It's not exclusive to the Democrats, but it matters more in the Democratic Party. And what the uncommitted movement is about is they don't really see a lot of opportunities to move the Republican Party vis-a-vis Gaza and Israel. And so they're focused on the Democratic coalition. And the only leverage that they really have, to the degree that it's organized, is to tell the Democrats, if you don't show more sympathy to what's going on in Gaza and to the Palestinians in Gaza, then we will withhold our votes and potentially cost you the election. And obviously that's frustrating to a lot of Democrats who are concerned that that there's a bigger picture involved. But when I mean, we see this true with socially conservative voters and the abortion question, for example, that your top three issues are Gaza, 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 then other things just including the economy, for example, just pale in comparison. Now, I'll say again, that's not most voters, but what the uncommitted movement is all about is trying to move the Democratic Party in a particular direction on Gaza.
Different than uncommitted voters are undecided voters. And that's something we also talk a lot, and we find out who are these people. So can you help us a little bit? Who are people who are actually undecided? Do they just not going to vote? Are they not caring? Do they not read? Or how can you be undecided between these two candidates?
Well, it's a fascinating question. It's one that, as political observers, we're constantly trying to better understand. In fact, that was our sort of main question in a new series that we're doing, Voter Voices, where we're trying to just identify, like, who are these people? Because it feels like there's so much information out there. And I want to sort of talk specifically about Michigan here because, we're ticket splitters and we're also independent voters. By some measure, 20% of Michigan voters identify as independent voters. So 1 in 5, right? Now that's very different though than undecideds. I mean, the latest polling that I saw out of the Detroit News just this week, I was talking to the politics editor there just yesterday, they're down to, at least in the presidential election, they're actually down to under 5%. And Chad Livengood, he says he thinks it's actually at 1% right now as undecideds. So I think we spend, so when we're talking about the electorate as a whole, 1% doesn't seem huge. But when you consider that Donald Trump won Michigan by 10,704 votes in 2016, suddenly 1% is a lot. Look, what we know is that some of these folks also are what we call low propensity voters. And that's actually who, as we were talking earlier about sort of who Donald Trump is going after when you talk about base and trying to kind of go back into your party and get your enthusiastic base out. What they're looking at is voters who don't tend to turn out, right? Because Donald Trump's sort of level of support, it's not over 50% in Michigan. He's never won 50% in Michigan. And so he's trying to get folks who don't normally turn out, or maybe undecideds. But I'm not so much sure they're undecided. It's more about whether they're undecided if they're going to vote or not undecided between Harris versus Trump.
It's always fascinating coming from a country that has so many parties in our parliament to see that people have just two choices. That's either or. You have to, or you stay at home, right?
And let me answer to that, because this is something that Rick and I have done a number of shows about, because here in Michigan, we have some third party candidates who are on the ballot, including Green Party candidate Jill Stein. She is not going to win the presidency. It's impossible for her to, because of course we have, for those who are watching internationally, this thing called the Electoral College. She simply could not become president. We have RFK still on the ballot here in Michigan, RFK Jr., I should say. He will not be able to win the presidency because he doesn't have enough votes nationwide in the Electoral College. But what they can do is be spoilers. And so you have folks like Jill Stein, who is spending a lot of time in Michigan. And the only place that she has spent time, though, in Michigan, Dearborn, which is the city where, as Rick was talking about, we have a majority of Arab American votes. And basically, that's where she is looking as this sort of vote-rich idea. But to your point, I mean, we are in a parliamentary system. We are a fundamental two-party system. And so what you sort of see is these third parties playing spoilers, or as we were talking about sort of uncommitted in February in the presidential campaign, you have these sort of anti-Trump or anti-Harris votes rather than a vote necessarily for Jill Stein or a vote for RFK Jr.
I'd just like to piggyback on that, briefly. Also, even though these third parties, largely act as spoilers, or they can drive the two big political parties to try and adopt a platform issue that they're pushing. But sort of the parliamentary function, the coalition building that comes with it, tends to happen in the primary elections as the parties try to, attract those people who are either less likely to vote, who are more passionate about a particular issue. That's where the coalition building party function often comes in, is in the primary election rather than in the general election.
Jeff, in the last couple of days, there are some polls out that seem to be like flashing the alarm signals for the Democratic ticket a little bit more in the three blue wall states. Do you see that too? Is there something we have been? There was so much talk about, will this momentum of the Harris campaign hold on? We had the debate, we had the vice presidential debate. Is there something happening that we have to talk about now? Is there some shifts that are concerning, or is this the typical horse race atmosphere that is driving us all crazy?
Well, I think looking at polls every day obsessively, as at least I do, doesn't tell you as much as we think that it does. I read something yesterday put out by a pollster, and I thought it was quite good. In that the way to look at polls in 16 and 20, they were off in the blue wall states. Of course they were, but they were off in the sense of both Clinton and Biden's margin of victory. But what wasn't off, according to this pollster in 16 and 20, in fact, they were within a point, is where the Democrat, either Clinton or Biden, ended up their overall percentage of the vote. And so they were off in terms of what Trump's eventual percentage was. And that's because he was getting a lot of undecideds, and there were in the past more undecideds in 16 and 20. And so the way to look at the polls, or at least the way I'm looking at the polls, is what does Harris have? What does Trump have? And I haven't really, it seems to me that it's Harris is up by 1 point in most of the polls, but you want to just look at the top line number. Because this is not 16 and 20. This is the lowest number of undecided voters in American history. And my understanding of who the undecideds are, because sporadic voters aren't often polled, right? Generally, when you're polling, you're trying to get people who vote more often. It's the Republican suburbanites. My understanding, that's a significant percentage of the undecided voters. And there's a poll that came out yesterday showing that 9% of Republicans were going to vote for Harris. And so then there's a vigorous effort of Republican voters for accountability. And it's an anti-Trump Republican group that is targeting Republican voters. And they were extraordinarily effective in Atlanta and Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and in Phoenix in 2020 in providing that margin of victory with Republican suburbanites. So I don't see the freak out in the polls that you're suggesting. I see a very, very tight race. And I'll tell you, the Trump campaign in Pennsylvania, dysfunctional. They're paying people to be canvassers. The Harris campaign, extremely organized, over 50 field offices. And so the difference between volunteers and paid people for the campaign going door to door, as opposed to third-party groups that Trump has, in a close election, the Democrats have the clear absolute advantage organizationally. In 16, Clinton ran a terrible campaign. In 20, there was COVID. This is the first time Trump has run against a Democratic Party that is actually going to be hitting on all cylinders organizationally and get out the vote efforts. It's going to be close. And maybe I know nothing about politics, but what that tells me, if it's close and one party has a campaign is organizationally hitting on all cylinders, and the other party is infighting and paying an outside group who are paid by the number of doors they knock on, not by the length of the conversations, which is how you convince people to turn out to vote, right? I mean, I think that's the story. And I've talked to Trump people who know that's the case, and they know they're freaking out behind the scenes about the mail-in vote and the early vote. They understand. John Fetterman won his 2022 Senate race before the disastrous televised debate because of the mail-in ballots. And so that's what you need to be looking at in Pennsylvania. Forget the polls. Just stop. Right? What you need to do, look at the early vote. And that is going to be dominated by Democrats. And that means on election day, You know, they're going to be organized and they're going to go and they're going to find their people and turn them out. It's going to be close. And maybe the Trump kind of magic sprinkle of being on these podcasts and talking to young men about MMA, you know, he outperformed his polls in 16 and 20. Maybe that'll happen again. But organization generally wins an election. And Trump ran a better campaign in 16, clearly. Better candidate, talked about the issues in a way that Democrats just didn't for a generation. And we can return to this. I think we need to return to the fact that Trump talks about things in the blue wall states that Democrats for a generation did not. There's a reason why Democrats struggle here. And a lot of the problems are with Democrats and we talk too much about Trump's demagoguery and not nearly enough about the political malpractice of Democrats not talking to working class voters for over a generation. I mean, I think that is a radically under-discussed problem of the Democratic Party and their struggles in blue wall states. A lot of these issues are with the Democratic Party, and it's, I mean, you know, taking for granted its working class voters. And Trump just stepped in and won them because he talked about these issues.
Chuck, before we open up, one question, and it is concerned with these kind of feeling that Trump addresses has found the better issues in the past, but maybe doesn't do it right now. Is it Trump's election to lose in Wisconsin? Is in Wisconsin right now almost every day, like in Pennsylvania. Who is more in danger of making the mistakes that are actually going to decide it?
Well, the Marquette University Law School does a very reliable poll, you know, pretty close to reliable anyway, that shows Harris up by 4 points. But there are some soft spots within that. And as in Michigan, our RFK Jr. is on the ballot, although the Republicans and RFK tried to get off the ballot but failed. Jill Stein is on the ballot, and there's a sizable pro-Palestinian group here that in the primary got nearly 50,000 votes as a protest votes against Joe Biden over the issue of Israel arms and lack of a ceasefire. So that's been part of the effort of Democrats, is to win back some of those folks who were the vote uninstructed movement here. And whether they're having some success, there was a group or two that has endorsed Harris that stayed out of Biden's camp earlier, but the Democrats need to round up, collect those folks and get them into the polls to vote for Harris. And it's not quite clear yet if they're going to do so.
One issue we have briefly touched on is the abortion issue. And one of our viewers here asks the questions: there are states with referendums to allow greater abortion rights, but the general idea of women's rights weighs heavy on most states. What do you see as a motivator for this issue in the blue wall states? And there's no one directly to answer that. So anybody wants to jump in?
Happy to take it. Yeah, I mean, what we have seen since the Dobbs decision was overturned is that every time that there is a referendum, every time that there is a question put to voters, even in red states, voters have voted to either restore or to allow reproductive freedom. And so, as Rick was talking about earlier in 22, we had a statewide ballot question, constitutional amendment to put reproductive rights into the state constitution, and it passed 57%, and our governor ended up winning by 11 points. Again, as Rick said, the Republican gubernatorial candidate was not amazing, but still 11 points was something. But for the first time in 40 years, Michigan also saw a Democratic trifecta, meaning both the state house and the state Senate went Democratic as well. Now, there was a change in redistricting, but we cannot underestimate any of those wins not being because abortion was on the ballot. We saw lines, hour-long lines of college students waiting to same-day register and then be able to vote. And when asked why it was time and time again because of reproductive freedom. And so what you are seeing down ballot in Michigan, for example, we have an open U.S. Senate race, a toss-up race that will help to determine the makeup of the U.S. Senate. And the Democratic candidate, Alyssa Slotkin, wants to talk about abortion. She is making abortion one of her main fundamental issues, whereas her Republican challenger, a former Republican congressman who has a long record on abortion, is now sort of changing his stance, right? He's had to sort of moderate his viewpoints. And so fundamentally, abortion remains on the top of mind of voters. And what we see in Michigan, at least, is that it remains sort of in the top three, right? It's sort of economy, inflation, immigration, and abortion. And depending on the poll, depending on kind of how it skews, you see abortion usually at 2 or 3. Last year, year before, it was in some cases the #1 issue.
Is that the same in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin?
I would say in Pennsylvania, I mean, one thing that makes the blue wall states distinct is a majority of voters are white non-college voters. And these are states where Democrats, perform well enough with these voters to win. And if you look at white non-college women, Bill Clinton was the last Democratic president to win that demographic. Harris is doing exceptionally well with white non-college women. So, suburban women, college educated, sure that, abortion rights kind of moving that demographic. But I think the sneaky one is white non-college women in the abortion issue driving them to Harris, whereas in the last 2 elections, Trump had won that demographic. And so we think about like losing by less, right, with rural voters, for example. That is a Trump demographic that what I've seen is that Kamala Harris is doing much better with, and that's very key in these 3 states because that's a significant part of the electorate, and that's about abortion.
Which brings me to the...
Oh, sorry, I was just going to quickly say what's fascinating by that, and to just sort of +1 to that is, and that's why you've seen this media strategy over the past week, a drastic change of what Kamala Harris has been doing in terms of media, going on a podcast, Call Her Daddy, right? That is the audience, to Jeff's point, that she needs to reach out to. And same with Black women. She was here in Detroit with Oprah. Right. And so, again, targeting and sort of geo-targeting. But on the other end, exactly to that point, you see Donald Trump doing better among white, undereducated males who are younger. And you see his podcast strategy, too, as you were talking about, going on podcasts and talking about MMA. Right. And so you're seeing the sort of media strategy and how they're sort of micro targeting these voters where they need, as we're talking about, continuing to get out the vote.
And one of the challenges in Michigan is that, the messaging is that abortion is on the ballot, but that's vis-a-vis the candidates, that there is not an abortion question on the ballot that would help drive turnout, which is, different than what in Michigan, which is different than, what we've seen in recent elections.
Which brings me to the question of the gender gap, and you already said that it seems to be getting wider and wider. I heard Celinda Lake, the Democratic pollster, say that it's important that we tell the woman to not vote per mail, but go into on voting day, because then their husbands cannot influence them. I think that was a very interesting point of the campaigning. Maybe to cover the abortion question in Wisconsin, Chuck, is that the same, or are there any other nuances we should look at and have in mind?
Well, the Democrats were really excited when 18 months ago, 6-8 months after the Dobbs decision, the state Supreme Court had an open seat, if you will, and the winner was someone who endorsed and supported and made a big part of her campaign, reproductive freedom, Janet Protasewicz. She helped tip the balance of the 7-person court from conservative to liberal, and because of abortion rights, that I think was a key factor in places like the suburban Milwaukee, where, she got enough support there to win, along with those big vote turnouts, places like Madison and Milwaukee. So Democrats ever since have been trying to keep abortion rights, reproductive freedom as a top issue here. And its polling has shown it's number 2, I think, among the Democrat voters as an issue. And so we had a reproductive freedom tour come through Wisconsin. In fact, it was Michigan Governor Whitmer at the head of that bus tour in Green Bay and suburban Milwaukee Waukesha. And after a few jokes about the Detroit Tigers and Detroit Lions doing well, she was quite willing to talk a little bit about the importance of the issue here. So there's not a ballot issue here, and abortion rights are back legal again after being banned basically for 15 months due to understanding of an 1849 law that was later ruled by a circuit court to be not applying to abortion. But there's still this appeal going on here in the courts, and that there are going to be oral arguments a few days after the November election. So while that high court now run by liberals might continue to support abortion rights, it is still an important issue, still an active issue here that Democrats are trying to make use of as much as possible. Trump at Dodge County, last Sunday didn't say a word about reproductive rights. Harris and Tim Walz in their visits here have mentioned it quite frequently.
Mm. Another question is the one the role of unions in these elections, and you've seen some endorsements for one side and a little bit disappointment for Harris' side. On the other side, especially in these 3 blue wall states, what role do unions still play? How strong are they in influencing? How bound are the people to go along? Whoever wants to jump in this case.
Well, I'll go on with Wisconsin, which has somewhere around 8 or 9% represented by union households. Just yesterday, I was at the local Teamsters Hall, where Obama era Attorney General Eric Holder was here talking with the Teamsters. While the national Teamsters have not endorsed in the presidential race, the Wisconsin councils, the councils representing 15,000 Teamsters here, have endorsed for Harris. Now, the local Teamster officials said, yes, we know there are Trump supporters in our membership, but overall they're knocking on doors. The council is knocking on doors, visiting workers at plant gates and so on, truck terminals and so on, and trying to push Harris. The AFL-CIO has strongly endorsed Harris. So it's, again, these little, but not so little, as we were saying from Michigan, percentages that the Democrats are counting on to add up to victory, not that one workplace sector dominates anymore, but more that it's a coalition and knitting together this tapestry.
Any other thoughts on the impact of unions? As Biden being the union president, how strong is Harris' connection?
And in Michigan, that's where Kamala Harris needs to shore up the vote. I mean, that is, as we were talking about at the very top, one of the reasons that Donald Trump was able to surprise many and win Michigan and the blue wall in 2016. Joe Biden was able to win some of those voters back because of his Pennsylvania roots. And I'll also say, look, because of what he looks like, I am going to be real honest, like he is a white man, and he was able to kind of get some of these voters out. And I think it's fascinating to talk to Debbie Dingell. She is a congresswoman from Michigan who was sort of the one, the Cassandra will you, who was telling everyone that Donald Trump was going to win in 2016 in Michigan. And everyone was like, oh, Debbie, you're just, and she was right, because she was talking to many of these voters. And I will say, I'm actually surprised that in Michigan, we are not seeing more visits. I think we probably will as election day gets closer, but more visits to union, more visits to labor voters by a Tim Walz, right? Tim Walz is the only candidate who actually is part of a union right? On the only candidate, I should say, among the presidential candidates or VP, like he should be out talking the talk the way that Joe Biden was in 20. And I think you will possibly see Bill Clinton be a surrogate soon here in Michigan and doing the same. But that is a voting block that when we're talking about sort of losing less is absolutely important in Michigan. And what you're probably hearing after this now 46 minutes is we are a lot of coalitions of a lot of different voters, and it's a little like whack-a-mole, right, in terms of like paying attention to one, but then you got to make sure that you're also giving some love to the other. And what does this coalition look like to get as many votes as possible?
And one of the questions, with unions is always how strongly is the rank and file going to follow the union leadership. That there's a system, every union has a different one, but basically it kind of goes, I mean, it's not like unlike a national election where there are regional groups that elect people that go to the super regional groups, and then there's in Michigan, for example, a statewide endorsement, and sometimes even a national endorsement. We're seeing some of the national groups, some of the national unions hanging back, while state and local unions weigh in. And also the other thing that I think is worth pointing out is, even though, yes, we are the industrial Midwest, but there are teachers unions, which are with Harris, and they're a big deal in Michigan. There's the Michigan Nurses Association, which is a very organized union, which is going along with Harris. And so it's not, I mean, the union vote is not a monolith by any stretch of the imagination.
I've seen that in Pennsylvania when Tim Walz was campaigning. There was really strong teachers and nurses. Yeah.
But that's very telling, is that the unions that are staunchly behind Democrats, these are people with college degrees. And when we talk about unions, we often think about that's a stand-in for working class voters. And the problem that Democrats have, I've written, kind of some scholarly work on this since the 60s, is the Democratic Party has become a party of, by, and for the professional middle class. And Tim Walz or Joe Biden, does it help that they're white men? Sure. But what I would argue even more, what helps is geographically and in terms of class, they have a toe that or at least feet in a world that is not of the highly educated of the top 25 cities in America. Barack Obama did well with the white working class in the North, right? For nothing more than he would do his college basketball bracket. He could talk like a normal person. Too many Democrats, I would argue, when they're running for the Senate and the presidency, think they're in a graduate seminar. And, Donald Trump, for all of his faults, when people listen to him, they don't feel like they're being talked down to. And, and part of why did Joe Biden do well in Northeast Pennsylvania or in Erie, Pennsylvania, or at least better than Hillary Clinton? Number one, he showed up. But number two, he just has a middle American feel. And I mean, Tim Walz went to Chadron State. And if anyone who's never spent time in Nebraska, they don't know what the heck that place even is. And, this has been the continual problem of the Democratic Party over the past 50 years is, losing cultural touch with its working class base. And, and that's always the uneasy balance. And, that was I think the smart, the brilliance of the Walz pick rather than Shapiro, because Walz can appeal to those voters, whereas Shapiro was just more of the same. I mean, he's Kamala Harris, but Philadelphia instead of Oakland.
I've some voters in Pennsylvania told me that he's somebody like us. We can meet him on the street. He looks like everybody else. Yeah, so that is kind of. But we have seen Barack Obama we will see Barack Obama campaigning much more. And you just mentioned him already. How in Pennsylvania? What can that change if he actually gets in? Barack Obama. Is that really the start of the last race?
In Pennsylvania, I mean, he is, far and away the most popular Democrat in America, and it's not even close. So, I mean, he
Well,
could come
Michelle
to Erie.
Obama may be number one.
Sure, Michelle, maybe, yeah, maybe, but former politician, either
Former
Obama.
president.
Yeah,
Former presidents, yeah.
either Obama are easily, I mean, they are the titular leaders of the party. And so, and again, why are Michelle and Barack Obama so, popular, right? I mean, they can talk, I mean, people, regular, ordinary people feel like they're talking to them, and they're smart, but they don't try to use, they don't try to prove it. And I think Kamala Harris has shown many of those same skills. Like, she is obviously a very, professionally achieving person, but at the same time, like, she's able to kind of to put complicated things in normal vernacular. And I think that's something, that John Kerry, Al Gore, Hillary Clinton all struggled to do.
Mm.
I
One
think a
question.
lot about George W. Bush in 2000, right? He was the candidate that people said you'd want to go have a beer with. It's one of the reasons that our governor, Gretchen Whitmer, has become such sort of a brand ambassador for the Democratic Party, as Rick likes to say, is because she is that candidate that you want to go have a beer with, right? That they seem like you.
Yeah, she is so incredibly I've only seen her, here and there, but just with real political gifts, really smart and really personable and down to earth.
Mm.
And in Wisconsin, I would be shocked if Barack Obama doesn't campaign here soon in Milwaukee, or Michelle Obama. I've heard them both speak at length, and they both are great at turns of the phrases and getting people out to vote. And that's one of the things Democrats are a little bit worried about in the Milwaukee Black population and Latinos. Will they vote for Harris as well as eagerly as they were willing to come out for Obama 12 years ago? So we expect one or both Obamas.
Mm. The Latino vote is interesting. The whole talk of the vote is shifting, and Latino men are going to vote more Republican. Is that something that you can see in your states? Is that more talk than actually development?
Yeah, in Michigan, I guess it's sort of the same thing, is that the Latino Hispanic vote is not a monolith, that you go to the west side of the state that borders Lake Michigan, and that's a big agricultural area, and there are a lot of families who are, if they're not immigrants themselves, they are the children or the grandchildren of immigrants who sort of have their, American, we came here and, set ourselves up and succeeded story, also very Catholic. And so you see a significant conservative Hispanic presence in West Michigan, which again gets back to that, losing by less when you're talking about a segment of the population. In our last gubernatorial election, the running mate of our disastrous Republican gubernatorial nominee was a Hispanic former legislator from more southeastern, Michigan, but it was an effort to try and win over a portion of the Hispanic Latino vote.
Mm-hmm.
I would say in Wisconsin, real quick, that the danger for Trump is his emphasis on immigration and illegal immigration. While there's a lot of Latinos here that are here legally, have been here for generations, and I don't think Trump is helping himself with those voters if they're undecided on the economics or Trump's machismo or whatever, that to hear him speak so bluntly about illegal immigration and millions coming in and so on might be a factor in the remaining weeks as to how people vote.
Mm-hmm. Even though you can hear immigrants who came legally here, you can hear them say that they don't want illegal immigration because they have waited, that they have done their job to come into the country. So it's sometimes you have this in countries that the ones who are already there say, well, we cannot let anybody else in who has a much easier way of getting into the country. One question of our viewers goes to Project 2025 and Trump's denial that he has anything to do with it. Does that have a big impact in the Blue Wall states, or is that more a Washington discussion?
Well, it's Project 2025. Well, first of all, the thing about Trump is that he's neither, embraced it nor rejected it, that this is an agenda that was created by people who are many of them are close to Trump or surrounding Trump. But, he can say with literal accuracy that, that's not mine, that's not ours. And, that is not our plan when we come, to office. And we see these sort of arguments in other earlier campaigns as well. But there's no doubt that, again, that the people who who created this do have the ear of Trump and the Trump / Republican establishment. And the fact that Democrats keep using it does suggest that they're seeing some traction there, because there are elements of that are very, unpopular with the public.
I think I saw new polling a few weeks ago that showed the only thing that had a higher unfavorable ratings than JD Vance was Project 2025. I think, during the DNC, during prime time, I mean, if you had played a drinking game every time that someone had mentioned Project 2025, you would have, been face on the floor. Mallory McMurrow, a state Democratic senator here in Michigan who sort of went viral a few years ago, she was the one who carried that giant Project 2025 book, if you watched the DNC. Yeah, I think a lot of political strategists are saying you should absolutely talk more about Project 2025. I mean, it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of just sort of oppositional research, right? And I think Democrats, I mean, the fact that we're talking about it right now means that it has, I think to some extent, been able to be a part of the national conversation.
The Democrats have handled this issue well. One can definitely say the amount of time we are talking about it is really huge. We are nearing the end. From a German perspective, we had state elections in parts of our country that also went through structural changes, like the states you are living in. What could you tell us to as like a lesson learned? How do you counter populism? What do you do against this feeling of being neglected and overlooked, that not somebody like Donald Trump can come in and convince people that he cares more than the actual politicians in Berlin?
Well, I guess one of the things is that if you're going to message based on that, you actually need to start long before the election. There's a saying, culture trumps strategy, and that people head into elections with beliefs and concerns, and the fact is that Donald Trump has effectively addressed those, when you're talking about, the working class and people who consider themselves working class, that, and that outweighs things like, and it seems like inflation is starting to get tamed, for example, but that data doesn't matter when people are going to the grocery store or looking at the interest rate on their mortgage or finding unaffordable housing, that if their lived experience doesn't match the data, then the data isn't really going to be a big influence.
I would say what we've learned since Obama is showing up. There's a small town in Erie County called Corey, and the Obama people, 95% white, if not more. The Obama people actually had the audacity to ask for people's votes, and he won all 4 wards going away in Corey, Pennsylvania. And what I've learned since 2008, talking to a series of strategists and candidates all throughout America, outside of big cities is Democrats after 2008 literally quit showing up. They literally, the House and Senate both had a rural outreach arm. They closed those offices after 2010 midterms. All throughout America, Democrats quit showing up in places like Erie, Pennsylvania, and places that weren't Madison, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh. I mean, in Pennsylvania, you'll talk to people who work in the Democratic Party, and they'll say the party itself for a good decade didn't care about anything that wasn't Philadelphia or Pittsburgh. And the lesson has been learned, and that there is a vigorous rural outreach effort on the Harris campaign. In Erie County, you have normie Democrats for state Senate and state rep running even in Republican areas that they probably won't win. And they go door to door and they introduce themselves. And so, when people in these areas might think about, oh, they'll hear something on talk radio or Fox News, but when you actually meet a normal Democrat who looks like you that it breaks through those stereotypes. And so, what are the lessons learned is that, if you want to stop populism, you have to go outside of the cities and outside of the knowledge worker elite. And Barack Obama proved that you can win their votes if you organize and you talk to people. And the Democratic Party just frankly got high in its own supply after 2009. And this belief that demography was going to naturally elect Democrats, I mean, what it did is it caused the Democrats to ignore large swaths of America. And look, Democrats are not responsible for Trumpism, but that's how you let Trumpism emerge, is you ignore large demographic groups, especially, the people who aren't winning in the knowledge economy. And if Erie County is going to stay in the blue column, and I think it will in 24, I think it's going to be largely because of the local party and its efforts in between these presidential elections. And that's the kind of effort that needs to be replicated outside of the big cities, all across, the blue wall states in America. That's how you beat populism, is by talking to voters.
Mhm.
I'll just say two sentences from Wisconsin. Show up for the Democrats, and then also try to have some success painting Donald Trump as unpatriotic. I attended the Harris visit to Ripon College, Ripon, Wisconsin, an hour and a half northwest of Milwaukee, where Liz Cheney, the former Wyoming congressperson, ripped into Trump, and largely over the January 6th riots. So show up and then try to paint Trump as not a true patriot.
Coming to an end, the last question, and I don't know if you want to answer it. How is it going to turn out on November 5th? I can ask the same question every day. And anyone?
I would just say in Wisconsin, where Milwaukee isn't able to count a lot of absentee ballots ahead of time. 4 years ago, it was 4 a.m. at the county courthouse when the city brought its ballots over, that sort of flipped things, and that triggered a lot of claims of a heisted election by the Republicans. So it could be another 4 a.m. kind of thing in Wisconsin. I'm not saying who's going to win, though.
I like Chuck's answer. Ever since 2016, I have stopped guessing who's going to win. But the counts are. I mean, and Jeff, you can talk about this, but my understanding is Pennsylvania may be the holdup, just because of how long it's going to take to count some votes. And again, with those 19 Electoral College votes, I mean, that could be the ball game, right?
Yeah, they can't. Republican Senate wouldn't change the rules. They can't even open the early vote until the night of the election.
Right. Right.
In Michigan, you can start processing the early votes early on election day, and they're already doing the pre-processing where they take the ballots out of the envelopes, they feed them into the machines. They just can't start tabulating the results until election day. But one of the things that we've historically seen in Michigan is that the later votes tend to break Democratic, and that includes counting the absentee votes. Well, it's kind of the opposite now, that since we're expecting more votes, fewer in-person votes, which are somewhat more likely to be Republican votes in Republican areas, is we may see early commanding leads among Democratic for Democratic candidates, according to the early tabulating, that will thin up as the night goes on, or even into the next day. But beyond that, I mean, I don't make predictions in elections because we've seen how foolish that can make you look.
I will tell, for people who want to have an early warning sign, North Carolina, Anderson Clayton, 26-year-old state party chair, has been organizing the heck out of rural North Carolina. And the Democrats have a real shot at taking North Carolina. I mean, that's where I'm looking at 8 p.m. Right. Have they called it for Trump yet? How close is it? I think that's the sneaky state, which if Harris wins Nevada, North Carolina, she can lose Pennsylvania. Although, so I'm not making predictions. Look at North Carolina. If it's called early for Trump, it's going to be a long week. I mean, we're not going to know is what I mean, because Pennsylvania is going to hold it up.
We all have to sleep very long, very much before that night. I thank you all so much. I learned a lot. I could go on forever, but I think we are out of time. John, I cannot see him, but I thank you all, and I hope we stay in contact. And I wish everybody an interesting last 4 weeks, 25 days, and a good election for this year.
Thanks for the invitation. I learned a lot.
Thank you.
And thank you, Julianne, for your great questions, your wonderful handling of many different topics. But Chuck, Jeff, Rick, Zoe, thank you so much for your insights, weighing in, guiding this conversation. And of course, thank all of you who tuned in, who had great questions, great insights to lend to this. Of course, a reminder for more information on the Heartlands Transformation Network, as well as the JES, head over to our website, jeserie.org. You'll find this video archived there, as well as past discussions that we've had. And of course, all eyes on that U.S. presidential election. But thank you all again so much for a vibrant, insightful, and wonderful conversation. For the Jefferson Educational Society and the Heartlands Transformation Network, of which we are a proud partner, I'm Ben Spigen. Thank you for listening and learning with us.